What's up everybody, welcome back. In today's video I want to take a look at setting up a dynamic waypoint that we can use to guide players towards a destination. So we're going to make this multiplayer ready. So currently I'm testing on the host, but this also works for clients. And as you can see, when the player moves around, the waypoint actually updates, and if the player reaches the location, the waypoint will be removed. So we're going to make this based on a component, so we can simply add a component to a character and then call the create waypoint function for that character to create a waypoint. There's some options you can set for the waypoints as well, so this is going to be pretty easy to use and implement in different kind of projects. If you like the channel, please consider leaving a like, and if you want to get access to premium channels in the Discord and some premium project file downloads, you can become a YouTube member or a Patreon, and then you will get access to those as well. So with that stuff out of the way, let's dive into today's video. So first of all, let's take a look at the project setup. So I'm using Unreal Engine 5.2, but you can do this in pretty much any version. That shouldn't really matter, this should work. Obviously we need a level to test, so I have made a few small changes to the third person level in here, but other than that, this is just a default third person project. So you can start with a third person or first person template and simply use that. So I've duplicated some of the meshes in here so we can test a little bit better if everything works, but that's the only thing I changed. So to make our waypoint work, we obviously need some kind of destinations to test it. So in a normal game you would have a quest or objective that you can use for the destination, but we don't have that. So I'm simply going to create a simple blueprint that we can use to test our waypoint later. So I'm going to go to the blueprints folder and create a new blueprint class and choose the actor. So this is going to be the BP test destination. And let's open it up. So all I'm gonna do in here is add a simple static mesh component so we can see it, and that's about it. So a static mesh, and I'm gonna set this to the pillar, like so. So we can simply put a few of those in the level and use those as a random destination. So let's open up the level again and drop in a few of our destinations. So let's put some up here and then maybe another one in the back over here. So we should have something to test with right now. Another thing we need to make this work is we need to make sure that our level has a NavMesh. So we want to go to the place actor section and look for a NavMesh bounce volume. And then we can drag that into the level. So we want to make sure that this will actually cover the entire level. So on the right side, we can change the scale, for example. And that should make it expand. So we want to make sure the entire level is covered. And also that it goes on top of all of the stuff that we want to move on. So if we press the P key on our keyboard, you can see the NavMesh being generated, and all the green parts are the parts where you can actually navigate. So we need to make sure that everything is covered in here. Let's raise it up a little bit. So something like this should do. Oh, it's missing a small part over here. So there we go. So you need to make sure you have this NavMesh in place, otherwise it won't work. So we can save this and close it down. So that's the level preparation. Now I want to do a small preparation for the rest of the waypoint. So I'm adding starter content and I'm using a prop from that. So a simple shape, I'm sorry. That's the shape cylinder, and I'm using this mesh to create the spline to actually create the waypoint. So I want to put all of the assets in one folder so we can easily migrate this later if we want to. So I'm going to create a new folder in here and call this my game dev raw waypoint. And inside that folder, I'm going to create 3 new folders. So blueprints, and then we're going to have materials and meshes. So I'm gonna grab the cylinder mesh from the starter content and simply move that over to my own mesh folder. So let's drag it in here, move it. And then I'm gonna go to the materials folder and we need to create a new material for the spline. So I'm gonna right click, create a new material, and I'm gonna call this my material spline glow. So we can open it up. This is pretty simple. So we want to select this material node over here. And then for the blend mode, we want to make sure that we set it to, let me see, translucent, no, additive, I'm sorry. And then for the shading model, we want to set it to unlit. So that's all the way at the top. And then we need to specify a color. So if I hold the 4 key on my keyboard and click, I will get a 4 vector. And we can use this to make a color. So I'm simply going to make this a little bit of reddish. And then make sure it actually is red. So something like this. And give the alpha 1 maybe. Yeah, that should be fine. So now we can hook up the color output over here to the emissive color, and we want to grab the alpha over here and plug that in the opacity. And this is the entire material that we're going to use, so we can save it and close it down. Now let's go back to the shape cylinder mesh, and in here we're going to assign the material, so we don't need to worry about that. So we have it set to the spline glow material. Okay, so that's all of the preparation that we need. So now we can go to the blueprints folder and we can start creating the actual component. So right click, go to the blueprint class. And in here, we want to select an actor component. So let's call this my blueprint, game dev raw waypoint. And first of all, let's set up some variables that we're going to use for the settings. So let's create a new variable in here. And the first one is the goal distance. So we're going to turn this into a float. And then, so this is, now I'm going to explain what these variables do when we add them in the graph. That's probably easier. So for now, just add them. So this is the goal distance. And then we want another one, and that's the goal location. So this is going to be a vector. Then we need an update interval. That's going to be a float again. And then we need the update distance. That's a float as well, so that's good to go. And the last one we need is our Z offset. And that's a float as well. So with those variables in place, we can start setting up the actual graph. So let's start building the event graph. We're not going to use any of these events, so let's just get rid of those. We're going to create a new custom event and call this create waypoint. So first of all, we need to make sure that we set all of the options. So we're simply going to grab setters for all of these and drag them in. So we can pass on these to the event. So just grab a setter for all 5 of the variables that we just added. And then we can simply drag them onto the event node. So we can add inputs for them. There we go. And make sure we hook everything up. So that's good to go. The next thing we want to do is create another blueprint, and we're going to use that blueprint to prevent that we have to cast to a character. So a little bit of explanation. We need to spawn a few components, and currently we are a component as well. So we cannot add components to another component. So we need to add them to an actor. Now we can get our owner, which is our character, and then add the components to that. Only we also want to remove the components. And if we simply grab a destroy component node and use that, oh, not that one, but a destroy component node. If we use that on this component, that won't work because the owning actor of the component, which is the player, if we plug this in, needs to delete the components. So to prevent that, we actually need to know the owner. I'm gonna create an extra blueprint that's going to own all of the components that we spawn, so we can also remove them without having to cast or using interfaces. So let's move this out of the way. We're going to create a new blueprint class, and this time it's an actor. And I'm going to call this my BP Waypoint Manager. And that's for now all we need to do. So we can go back to the component, and in here we want to add a variable for the Waypoint Manager. So well, let's just right click in the graph and we can do a spawn actor from class. Spawn actor from class, there we go. And then spawn our Waypoint Manager in here. So for the spawn transform, we can make a transform and simply spawn it at 0, that's fine. For the collision, let's make sure we set it to always spawn, ignore collision. And then because we have the blueprint set in here, we can drag off the return value and promote it to a variable. So this is our Waypoint Manager, as you can see as in the variable type in here. So BP Waypoint Manager. And then before we actually spawn it, we can check if it's valid or not to prevent we spawn too much of them. So let's grab an isValid node for the actual variable. So isValid, but grab the one with the question mark, and we can hook it up over here. So if it's valid, we already spawned one. If it's not valid, we're gonna spawn one. So we want to hook this part up to the not valid node. And make sure you promote it to a variable, obviously. So with that out of the way, we want to spawn a spline component. And as I mentioned, we need to spawn a component on an actor. So if I right click over here and do add spline component, nothing pops up, as you can see. So if I would grab my Waypoint Manager, which is an actor, and drag off here, then I can do add spline component. I should be able to at least. Add component by class, okay, and then we want to add a spline component. So that works. So you want to look for the add component by class node. And as you can see over here, the target needs to be an actor. So that's why we need to hook up our Waypoint Manager. So if we spawned a spline component, we're going to do the same trick. So drag off here, promote to variable, and this is our spline component. And then we can check if this is valid or not before we actually spawn it. So let's grab our spline component from the variables and check if it's valid. So if it's not valid, this is the first time we are running this function, and then we need to spawn it, and otherwise it's already present and we can keep it. So we don't need to set any of these options, that should be fine. So if it's already valid, we also want to grab our spline component, and then we're gonna clear the spline. So no, clear spline points. And you want to hook this one up to the valid pin over here. So that will reset the component if it's already there. Now the next thing we want to do is grab our path array. So we're going to get an array of locations returned by the actual function that will get the path for us. And we're going to store that. So we need to create a variable, and we're going to call this the path. Why not? And I misspelled that, obviously, not really. So we're going to turn this into a vector array. And then over here, we want to grab that array and clear it to make sure that we start with a fresh array without any points in it. So hook up both of the execution pins in here, and then we can continue. And at this point, we need to grab a branch and check if we are the server or not. So is server. If we are the server, then we can actually call the function to get the path directly. If we are a client, we need to make sure the server does it for us. So the client cannot handle the path component and navigation mesh, so we need to do that server side. So we need to create a custom event for that. And let's do that first. So right click, create a custom event. The first one we're going to do is get path. And this is going to be a normal event. And then we're going to create a second custom event and call this server get path. So for server get path, we want to set the replication on the right side to run on server. And then from here, we can call our get path function. So if we are a client, we're going to call this part to make sure we replicate it to the server and then call the getPath function. If we are already on the server side, we can simply call the getPath function. So for the getPath function, we need an input, and that's going to be the target location where we want to draw the waypoint to. So target location, and that's going to be a vector. So now we can pass on the vector to the server getPath, so both of the functions will have the input, both of the events, I'm sorry. And then for the normal getPath function, we can drag over here and do find a path to location, and then synchronously. So select this node. The target location is going to be the path end, and the path start is going to be the player location. So we can simply get the owner of this component, which is our character, and then from that we can get the actor location. If I actually spell that right, get actor location, and that's going to be the starting location of the path. So this will return the path. If we drag off here, we can do get path points, and those will be the actual locations of the path. So with this array, we want to make sure that the path is actually valid. So first of all, let's drag off the return value and do is valid. And you want to grab the one under navigation. So target is the navigation path. Make sure you grab that node, and we're going to hook it up to a branch over here to make sure the path is valid. And let's disconnect it for now. So we're going to get an end node, and just to make sure, we're going to grab the array over here and check the length of the array to make sure it's greater than 0. So there's actually any points stored in the array. So let's do greater than 0 and plug it in. And this is going to be our condition. So if this is true, then we want to create the path. And we need another custom event for that. So let's go back down over here and create another custom event. So I'm going to call this owner create waypoint. And for this event, we want to make sure we set the replication over here to run on the owning client. So if the server actually retrieved the path, we're going to replicate it back to the owning client, which is the local player with the keyboard and the monitor in front of him. And that's the only player that actually needs to see the path. So that's the player that's going to create the spline as well. So over here from the true pin, we're going to call our owner create waypoint. And now we do want to make sure that we pass on our path points from here. So we're going to give this one input. And that's going to be the path. And again, that's an array of vectors. So now we can simply plug in our path over here into the event call. And again, make sure this is set to run on owning client. So this will return back to the local player. So if we go back to the branch over here is server. If we are the server, we can simply call our get path. And if we are a client, we're going to call server get path. And all we need to do in here is hook up our target destination. So we can grab that from the actual input over here. So we already have it stored in a variable, the goal location. So I probably should have named this goal location as well, but that's my bad. So we can simply hook it up over here to pass it on to the events. So this will call the getPath function, that will call owner create waypoint, and then the path will be returned to us over here. So the first thing we're going to do is store that path on the local player. So none of these variables are replicated. So we want to make sure that we store the path on the local player. So grab a setter and simply plug it in over here. Then we're going to get the first node, so first index. So get a copy of index number 0, and that's the starting location of the waypoint. So we want to store that as well. So drag off here, promote to variable, and this is our waypoint start location. So we can use this later without having to break the array constantly. Now at this point, if we create a waypoint over here, we want to make sure that we remove any other waypoints that may already be there. And the reason I'm waiting till this point to do it is because over here we already checked if the new path is valid. So if we try to create a waypoint for a path that's not valid, it will also not remove a previously created waypoint. So over here we're going to remove the existing waypoint if any are in the level. And as I mentioned, we need to do that on the actual actor that owns the components. So in this case, we need to go back to our waypoint manager. And we want to set this one up first. So let's go to the event graph, and this is going to be a really simple blueprint. So first of all, let's get rid of all of this stuff. Okay, it won't let me delete it, so just keep it fine. We want to add an array of spline mesh components in here. So we're going to create a new variable, and those are the spline meshes. So change the variable type to a spline mesh component. Simply an object reference, and then right click to turn it into an array over here. Let's create a new custom event, and we're going to call this remove waypoint. And all we want to do in here is grab our array of spline meshes, and we can destroy a component. So if we simply right click and look for destroy component, we get the normal, we get the normal destroy component node, and we can just plug in an array in there. So let me show you a destroy component. So get rid of the default scene root. We can simply plug in an array over here, although the pin doesn't tell us that we can do it, and this will work. So we don't need a for each loop. This will delete all of the instances in the array. And then we simply want to clear the array. So grab the array and clear it. So this is the only thing we're going to do on this blueprint. So compile and save it. So it's a very light blueprint, and that shouldn't be any issue. Now in here we can grab our waypoint manager and clear the waypoint. Remove the waypoint, sorry. Here, so this will delete a previous waypoint if any exists. And then we need to set up the actual new waypoint. So first of all, we're going to grab the path, and we're going to use a for each loop. So plug it in here. And along this path, we're going to use a spline to actually create the waypoint. So we want to grab our spline component and add a spline point at index. So drag the spline component in, and then simply look for add spline point at index. We're going to hook this up to the loop body. The position is the array element, and the index is the array index. So that's pretty simple. We want to change the coordinate space to world, and we're going to deselect update spline for now. So we don't want to update it for everything we add. We're simply going to update it once after everything is done. But we also want to set the spline point type. So if we drag off the spline component and look for set spline point type over here, and we need to make sure that we grab the same index and plug it into the point index. And then for the type, we're going to say constant and also deselect update spline. So that should be good to go. There's actually one small thing I forgot. So I added a Z offset in the settings over here. This will raise the waypoint off the ground, so we can select how high we want to make the waypoint float above the ground, and that's set by the Z offset. So in here for the array element, we want to drag off and add another vector to it. If we right click the bottom pin, we can split the struct pin and then simply add our Z offset to the Z over here. And that's actually going to be the new position for the spline. So make sure you add the Z offsets to the array element in here. Okay, so this will create the spline along the path. And if this is done, we're going to update the spline once. So let's drag off the completed pin, grab the spline component, and we want to update the spline and hook it up. So instead of updating it every single time we change something, we're simply going to update it once after we're done. Now that we have our spline set up, we can actually create the spline mesh. So we're going to grab a for loop over here, not for each, but for. And we want to start at index 0, so that's good. And the endpoint is going to be the last index of our path array minus 1. So we're going to grab our path array and then look for last index. And from here, drag off and do minus 1. And that's the last index of the for loop. And in here, we want to add a spline mesh component. So again, we need to grab our add component by class node. So for the target, we're going to hook up our waypoint manager. And then for the class, we're going to select spline mesh component. This one. This time we need to enable manual attachment. And then we want to set some stuff for the spline mesh component. First of all, we're going to add it to the array on the waypoint manager so we don't forget. So we're going to grab the waypoint manager and get our spline meshes, the array we added earlier, drag off the array and simply add an item to it. So we're going to add the return value. So right now it's stored. The next thing we want to do is drag off the return value again, and we want to set the mobility. So because we're attaching it, we need to make sure that the mobility is not static, otherwise we cannot attach it to other components or actors. So we want to change this to movable, and that should be good to go. Let me move this down a little bit. So the next thing we want to do is set the actual static mesh for this component. So drag off again, and then we're going to set the static mesh. Plug it in here, and the static mesh is the shape cylinder that we created earlier where we changed the material. So shape cylinder, and that should be the one with the spline glow material added to it. After we spawned the mesh, we want to set the start and end locations and tangents. So we're going to drag off the return value again and then set start and end. So this node at the top over here. Plug it in first, and we can actually get this information from the spline component. So what we want to do is grab our spline component in here, and then we're going to get a location at spline point. Over here, get location at spline point. So for the point index, for the first one, we can simply grab the index from the for loop. So over here, and we're going to plug that into the point index. The coordinate space, we want to set it to world. And then this is going to be the starting position. Now we also want to get the tangent, so we can drag off the spline component again and get the tangent at spline point. And again, we can simply grab the index and plug that in over here, change the coordinate space to world, and then plug this one into the start tangent over here. And then we can grab our spline component with these nodes again. So let's copy and paste them. But instead of grabbing the index from the for loop, we're going to grab the index and add 1 to it. So drag off here, do add and add 1. So we're going to get the next point in the spline, and from that point we also want to get the starting point and the tangent. And then we can hook those up over here as well. So this is the end position and then the end tangent, like so. So we can disable the update mesh over here, and we're going to do that later because we also want to set the start scale. So drag off the return value again and then set start scale over here. Plug it in. Again, we can disable update mesh. We're going to do that later. And let's make a vector 2D. So drag off here, make a vector 2D. And we actually want to scale this down a bunch, so I'm going to set it to 0.03 for both of them, X and Y. And this is the starting scale, so we also want to set the end scale, so we're going to drag off again and then set end scale and plug everything in. So the execution pin, the make vector 2D, and for this one we can leave update mesh enabled. So this is the last thing we're going to do for this mesh, and then we can update it. So that should be good to go, and we should have our spline mesh created. And then there's only one thing really left to do, and that's removing it after a certain time. So if we go to the completed pin over here, we can add a retriggerable delay. Retriggerable delay over here. So I'm going to make it disappear after 3 seconds. You can play around with this value or even add it to the event all the way over here as an input, so you have it as an option. You can do that as well if you like to. For now I'm simply going to set it to 3 seconds. And after those 3 seconds we want to get rid of the waypoint. So we can grab our waypoint manager and let's make sure it's valid. Why not? So plug it in over here. If our waypoint manager is valid, we're going to drag off and remove the waypoint. If it's not valid, we're not going to do anything. And then we're going to do the same thing for the spline component. So drag it in here and let's make sure that it's valid. Hook up both of the execution pins over here. And if our spline component is valid, we're going to clear the spline points. So clear it and hook it up to the is valid pin. Okay, so that should be pretty much good to go. So let's compile and save it. And then we can add it to our character so we can test it. So let's make a simple setup to test this. So let's go to the blueprints, third person character. The first thing we want to do is add our new component. So add the component, look for GDR waypoint. And now it's in here. So we can simply drag it into the event graph. And then from here we can call our create waypoint function. Now, like I mentioned, we need a destination and we don't have any quest systems or objectives or anything like that. So I'm just going to use a key on my keyboard. So I'm looking for a keyboard T, so I can test it with the T key. And then I want to get all actors of class. And we're going to get all of our testing destinations. So test destination. And this is an array, so we can get a random item from the array. And then simply get the actor location from that item. And that's going to be the location for our waypoint. So now we have a few options. We can set the goal distance. This will be the maximum distance to the target, so the goal of the waypoint, and if we reach this distance the waypoint will be deleted. So let's say if I'm 150 units or closer, then the waypoint will be removed. We have an update interval, so every x seconds it could update the spline, and in here we can define how often we want to do it. So I'm gonna set it to 0.4 seconds, maybe something like that should work. We're also going to use an update distance. So at a certain point where the player is further away from the starting point of the spline than this distance, then the spline will be updated. So if we set the update interval to 0.4, but we don't move around, so the distance between the start of the spline and the player is still smaller than our update distance, then nothing will change. If the update distance is actually greater than what we set here, then the spline will be updated. So we can set it to something like 250 and that should be fine. For the Z offset I'm going to use something like 30 units, so it will be a little bit above the ground. So with this in place we should be able to do a quick test. So let's compile and save everything, and we could start with 2 players. That should work. So let me grab the viewports over here. And obviously, because we play 2-player, we want to make sure that we set the net mode to listen server. Otherwise, we can't even see each other. So there we go. Now if I press the T key on my keyboard, it should actually display the waypoint, and it kinda does. And it also kinda doesn't. So I am seeing a waypoint over here, but it's not actually the gray color that we needed. And if I press the T key again, nothing happens. So it kind of works, but not really. So let me see. We are creating the waypoint, and I don't have the valid pin in here hooked up, so that's gonna mess everything up, obviously. So that's a screw up, and this is how it should be. And that should be better now. I'm not really sure why the material is not working. So let's try again and see what happens. So I can change the spline by actually pressing the button again. So that part is working. The only thing that's not working is that it's not red. And we currently do not have the updating setup, so it won't update as the player moves around. So let's have a look at the updating first. And we want to add a small function for that. So let me grab my notes quickly. Over here, so right before the retriggerable delay, we're gonna add the update timer. So we're gonna make a little bit of room over here, and we're gonna grab a branch first. So let's move over this execution pin. And if this branch going to return false, so we're gonna add a condition later. We want to set a timer by function name. So this one. And from here, we'll get a return value. That's the timer handle. So we can drag off here and promote this to a variable. This is going to be our waypoint timer handle. So now we can grab that variable over here and check if it's valid or not. So is a valid timer handle. So we're going to plug this into the condition. So if it's not valid, we're going to create it. If it's already valid, we are going to leave it alone because it's already running. Now for this timer, we want to grab the update interval from the options and plug that into the time. Then we're going to make sure we set it to looping over here. And then all we need to do is fill in our function name. So for example, we can call this waypoint timer. And I'm going to copy the name immediately. Then I'm going to create a custom event and give that the same name, so waypoint timer. So this event will be called every time this timer fires. So we're going to pretty much loop it and then fire it every time to check the distances. So for this waypoint timer over here, we need to create a function, or we don't really need to, but it makes our life a little bit easier. So we're going to create a new function and call this check update distance. So in here, first of all, we need to get the actual player location. So let's get the owner of this component. And from the owner, we're going to get the actor location. And we're going to store this in a local variable. Promote to local variable, and this is the local player location. So we have that stored to work with. First of all, let's check the distance to the goal location, so to the end of the waypoint. And we're going to use squared distances because that's just cheaper to check than normal distances. So every time you do a distance check and you can use a squared distance, make sure you do that. So we're going to right click and look for squared distance. Over here. And we want to pick the one that simply uses a vector as an input. So distance squared vector. And then for the starting location, we can plug in our goal location. And for the other location, grab the local player location. So this will return a squared distance. So we need to make sure that we turn these values into squared ones as well. So let's drag off here and do less than. And we can grab our goal distance and simply multiply it with itself. So drag off here, do multiply and plug it into both of the pins. So now we have the squared goal distance and we can compare it over here. So if this condition is true, that means we actually want to remove the waypoint. So we're going to grab a return node over here and give it an output. And the first one is going to be a single boolean. So turn it into a single bool. And that's going to be update waypoint. And we're going to add a second one, and that's going to be remove waypoint. So for this return node, we want to remove the waypoint. So enable that one, and that should be all. Now, if this returns false, we want to do the same distance check again, pretty much. So let's just copy and paste this stuff down here. Plug it into the false bin, but this time we want to check the waypoint starting location. So get rid of the goal location and plug in our waypoint start location. And now we don't want a smaller than, but we want a greater than. So swap that out for a greater than. And over here, we want to plug in our update distance instead of our goal distance. Like so. Plug this one into the condition again. And we're going to grab another return node. So if this is true, then we want to update the spline and not remove it. So enable update. And that should be good to go. Now, if the second branch returns false as well, we don't need to do anything. So we can simply disable this and nothing will happen to the existing spline. That looks good. So this is our check update distance function. We can go back to the waypoint timer over here and simply call our function. So check update distance, plug it in over here. Now let's grab a branch first. So if we want to update the waypoint, then we're simply going to call our create waypoint function. And in here, we can grab all the variables that are currently set in here. So we're simply going to reset everything. So plug them in, goal location, goal distance, update interval. And then we have the update distance and the Z offset. So this will recreate the spline for us. And if this is false, we want to grab another branch and check if we might want to remove the waypoint. And if we do, we can simply grab the true pin over here and then plug it in down below. So over here into the waypoint manager is valid node. So we can start deleting this part. Now that should be good to go. So we disconnected this pins over here. So we want to hook this back up to the retriggerable delay. So both of the execution pins, if the waypoint timer is already valid or if it's not valid. So both of them need to be hooked up to the retriggerable delay. And because we have this timer running, if we remove the waypoint, we also want to get rid of this timer. So let's go to the end over here. And then we can simply grab the timer handle and check if this is valid. So is valid timer handle. And we want to plug this into a branch. So let's grab both of the execution pins over here and hook it up. And if our timer is valid, we're going to drag off and clear and invalidate timer. And plug that into the true pin. So that's good to go as well. Now there is only one thing left to do, and that's if we go up here. So all the way to the get path function, we check if the path is valid. If the path is not valid, we want to call the update timer. So we're going to reset it. So what this will do, if we already have an existing waypoint and we jump off a ledge, for example, so we are in the middle of the air, at that moment the path will return invalid. And to prevent that, the timer will keep running and delete the waypoint. We're going to simply reset the timer by triggering our retriggerable delay. So what we want to do is go down here to the retriggerable delay node, and we're going to create a custom event. And I'm going to call this owner reset delay. So this needs to be run on the owning client. for the replication setting, and then simply plug it into the retriggerable delay. And then if we go back over here to the get path event, if the path is not valid, we're gonna call owner reset delay. So that should pretty much be the final piece of the puzzle. Now I'm gonna check why the material does not show red, and then I'll be back and we're gonna test this. Okay, that wasn't too bad. So we need to go into the material, and there's actually a little checkbox that I forgot. So if we scroll down over here, we want to enable used with spline meshes and make sure you set that to true. Save the material out, and then everything should work. So right now we can test it. Let's open our game in here. So we can start with the server or the client, that doesn't really matter. And right now if I press T on my keyboard, you will see the waypoint appear and it will update as I move around. So if I press it again, it will choose another random destination. And if I get close enough, it should delete the waypoint. So now it's gone. And as you can see, I'm the client and the server cannot see my waypoint, and it should be the same the other way around. So if I grab the server over here, then the client cannot see his waypoint. So all of that stuff is working. So as you can see, the updating, it's working and it's a little bit choppy. So you can play around with the options to make that smoother, but also keep in mind the smoother you make, the more replicated calls you will make, so it will be more costly. So if we go into the waypoint over here, well, actually it's easier to go into the character. So if we, for example, change the update distance, so make that 100 seconds, 100 units, and then update every 0.1 second, then it will be a lot smoother, but you will make a lot more replicated calls, so it will be more costly as well. So right now you will see if I move around, the updating of the spline is a lot smoother. It's not that jumpy, but it will cost you more replication. So that's a decision that you need to make for yourself. So that's the entire component done, to be honest. So we can add a little comment over here and then tell us what these options will do. So the goal distance is the distance where the waypoint will be deleted. So distance till target when waypoint gets deleted. Nope. And then we have the update interval and the update distance. So update interval and distance. So interval in seconds for updating. If, let's make that capital, so if the player distance till start point is greater than the update distance. So that's what those two will do, and then the Z offset, obviously just the offset of the ground, so that should be pretty self-explanatory. So we have a replicated waypoint. We can simply grab this component, add it to any character, and then call this create waypoint event, and everything will work. So the last thing I want to do is walk through it to explain how it works, and maybe here and there add some little comments. So we're going to start in the third person character. One little important note in here. To make sure this works in multiplayer, the create waypoint needs to be called by the owning player or the local client. So that's the same thing. The owning player of your character is also the local player. So to make sure this works, an input event, for example, is local. So from an input event, you can hook it up directly. If you're calling this from a server's instance, you need to replicate it to the owning client and then call the create waypoint event. So needs to be called on the owning client / local player. So that's pretty important to make everything work in multiplayer. Now for the actual creating of the waypoint, we can add a few comments in here. So what we're doing in here for the waypoint manager, for example, I'm just going to copy the comment from my actual example project. So we're spawning the waypoint manager if it's not valid, because we cannot add components to a component, and the owning actor of a component needs to be the one deleting it or it won't work. So to prevent casting or using interfaces, we're using this waypoint manager that will own and destroy the component. So that's what the waypoint manager does. Then the next thing we do over here is spawn or reset the spline component. So spawn or reset spline component. Okay, so ignore the spelling, that's not too important. Over here we're clearing the old path. Then we're getting the new path on the server side over here. So we need a bit of room probably. So get path server side. Then for the actual get path functions over here, we're getting the path. So get path. Then we're checking if it's valid. And then over here, we're passing it back on to the client. So replicate back to owning client. And over here, we're resetting the delay if the path is not valid. So I'm going to copy this one again because I made this a little bit bigger. So over here, reset, for example, if we have a valid path but jump off a ledge, this will prevent deleting the path and reset the delay. So that's what that does. And then we can go to the owner create waypoint. So over here, we're simply saving the new path. So save path. Oh, already. Well, you know what it means, save path. And then over here, we want to save the start location. Oh, I'm trying to do this much too fast. This sucks. Okay, so save start location. Then we're removing the waypoint over here. So again, I'm going to copy this one and paste it in here. So remove old waypoint if there's any. And we're waiting until here till we do this to make sure the new path is valid. So that's what we're doing over there. Then over here for each loop, we are creating the spline. So create spline along path points. Then over here, we're updating the spline once. So update spline once when everything is set. And then we have the for loop. So over here, we're actually creating the spline mesh using the information from the spline component. So we can grab the entire for loop stuff. And we are creating the spline mesh with the information from the spline component. Over here. Then down here, we're setting up the timer to actually update the waypoint. So that's over here. Update the waypoint timer. And then this isn't too important. So over here we are checking the distance to update waypoint. Oh freaking, well, you know what it means. And then the last things we do over here is actually remove the waypoint components, so the spline meshes. And then over here we're resetting the spline. And over here we are clearing the timer. So that's what we're doing. So now we at least have a few comments in here so we know what's happening if we come back to this project in a few months. So that's all I got for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider leaving a like and I'll be back soon for more. Talk to you later guys. Bye bye.